Hello, Internet, and welcome to episode number 236 of the Comic Watchers Show. I'm Matt, and he's the disembodied voice of Chad. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We have got an awesome guest for you. You know him from his works on X-Men, Sex, Blood Squad 7, and most recently, Johnny Quest. His name is Joe Casey, and perhaps you have read his comics, as he's written quite a few of them. So, Joe, welcome to the show.
How you doing, guys? Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, dude. So, before we really dive into this thing, we always kind of like to play a little bit of getting to know you. For those who may not be familiar with your very prolific oeuvre, who is Joe Casey and why does he write these comics? What is your origin?
Well, I couldn't say why. It's been so long, but I think in comics I've written everything for everybody, every publisher, every character. I feel like I've been there, done that. So I've been around.
I was going to say, I was brushing up on your bibliography because I've been reading your stuff since the 90s, and I was just like, my God, this man, what hasn't this guy written?
It's true.
And I know you get a lot of love for your Wildcats run and for your independent books, but here and now we're talking about Johnny Quest. So that started in August, I believe, and it's picking up from where the show ended. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, we're using the first season or the only season of the original show from 1964 as our starting point. That's our Bible. So it takes place in that time and era with the characters in that version of the characters. We're not updating them or anything like that.
Right on. So you're going for like a specific retro pastiche type vibe, or just playing it a little more honest, as it were?
No, we're playing it straight. It's not a pastiche or anything like that. And in the first storyline that's out right now, we bring the whole Quest crew into 2024 through a little time travel whoopie-doo. And it's great. It's great to juxtapose those 60s characters with a modern world. That's kind of the point of the first story arc, seeing how they handle themselves in a world they probably don't recognize.
Right. So, Chad, jump on in, buddy.
So what's your personal history with Johnny Quest? Did you watch the cartoon growing up, or how much of a research did you have to do to kind of start writing?
Well, I grew up with the cartoon. It was ubiquitous on Saturday mornings when I was a kid. Even though there's only one season, I think they just cycled through all three networks Saturday mornings for all through the 70s and 80s. So I've seen it all. And there was also a great comic book series in the 80s published by Comico, written by William Esther Loebs and drawn by a lot of cool artists that I was a big fan of, probably even more than the show. As I've gotten older and looked back on the actual show, I've appreciated a lot more. There's things about that I didn't know, like that it was a primetime cartoon. It was one of the few primetime cartoons that ever existed back then. Because of its pedigree, its artistic pedigree, created by Doug Wildey, who's a great comic book artist, and of course designs by Alex Toth, who was another genius comic book artist. That show looked more like a comic book to me than any other show that was around at that time. And even with shows like Super Friends and Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, Johnny Quest was the one that looked like a comic book to me. It looked like comic book art come to life. So I've always had a soft spot for it for that reason. So when I got the gig, there wasn't that much research I had to do. I knew the characters, I knew the milieu, I knew the setting. I went back and watched some of the original episodes just to get the voices down, but that didn't take very long. And getting in that groove was a lot easier than I thought it would be, actually.
Right on. So Were there any unique when you're adapting properties? You have to balance the needs of the property versus your own voice as a writer. Was there anything unique in Johnny Quest that challenged you in that way?
Well, at first, I got to be honest, I thought that there might be elements that did not hold up in terms of what was acceptable in 1964 to what would be acceptable in 2024, even if you were doing a period piece. But as I watched the episodes again, I realized there's a couple of things that I would have steered clear of anyway, like depictions of uh, you know different types of people and things like that, that were just stereotypical or at worst a bad cliche in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And now would just be completely politically incorrect. But aside from that, it really holds up, and there's not much about it that makes you cringe. Like, oh my God, I can't believe they did that in 1964. In terms of the characters and their family dynamic and the sense of adventure and the globe hopping nature of the series, it all still works pretty well. So when I had some trepidation, but that went away right away as soon as I really dug in and figured out what kind of story I wanted to tell. It was kind of easy, actually.
So you've kind of teased that you brought the Johnny Quest into the present. What is the overall story that you're telling? General terms, not to spoil anything.
Well, I mean, thematically, it's about getting a glimpse as to what your future may hold, and confronting that and accepting that, and would you change things if you knew about it? Or would you do things differently? How much damage could you do by knowing your own future? So that's kind of the underlying theme of the first story arc. But it's also, again, it's a globe hopping, serialized adventure. It's like it predates Indiana Jones by 15, 16 years, but it's got that same vibe. It's got that same spirit of adventure, and even if they're in 2024, they still go to Tokyo. They still go to India. They go all over. So it still feels like a Johnny Quest adventure, even though we brought them into 2024, which is may or may not be a permanent thing.
Tell us a little bit about your take on the family dynamic. I mean, obviously you didn't reinvent the wheel or anything like that, but was there anything unexpected writing that jumped out at you?
Well, maybe not unexpected, but I guess I was, as I really dug into the characters, I was surprised. That's a real forward-thinking family dynamic for 1964. Depending on how you look at it, but but it is a family. It's like the smart dad, the cool uncle, the two brothers that are bonded by more than just blood, and then the cute little annoying dog that runs around all. But it's just the great thing about these characters and how they relate to each other, which I think is baked into the material from the cartoon show on, which is they really are a family. They really do stick up for each other. They got each other's backs always. That loyalty I think is very resonant, and people responded to it then. I think people respond to it now. So while it's not a traditional family, the family bonds are really strong and really healthy, and they get tested, but they never break. And that's a very cool thing these days.
Well, in a very real sense, it's a found family, and
yes,
that's not something you saw a lot of in 1964 in popular culture.
No, but you see a lot of it today. So it's almost like they were ahead of the curve with that one.
Right. So what was the pitch like exactly for Dynamite? Was it, hey, did they approach you? Did you come to them? It's like, hey, you guys have this property that I kind of love. What you got cooking? or how did that work exactly?
Well, I mean, I've known Nick Barucci for 20 plus years by now, and I've done work for Dynamite in the past. When they announced that they got all these Warner Brothers IP, these cartoon properties, I dropped Nick a note and said, "Hey, congratulations! You guys are going to kill it." I did have my eye on a property that was already taken, but I guess that put my name in the mix because a couple months later, I got the call from Dynamite and said, "Hey, do you want to do Johnny Quest?" And it took me not long to say yes. Once I said, "This is how I do it. This is what I want to do. I'd like to be help pick the artist," because I knew that was going to be super important. And not only did they agree to what I asked for, but then the Warner Brothers agreed to the story I wanted to tell. So at that point, we're sort of off to the races. It was very, very quick and painless. Thank God.
So, as you said, you kind of had to pitch it to Warner Brothers. What is it like working with an IP like this that a lot of people know, but and has a storied history to it and everything?
Well, I've worked with established IP before, where there's a licensor that you have to clear things with. This one was relatively easy. The guy that is the liaison for these properties for Dynamite is a super cool guy and very chill and sees the value in what all the creators are doing in the comics. Thundercats, Space Ghost, and now Johnny Quest, and there's more to come. He just seems hip to what comics can do and what they need to do to present these characters to a new audience, or at least an audience that they haven't been published in a while. So that's been really, really smooth. And in fact, the second story arc that we're doing in Johnny Quest, when I pitched that one, it was kind of a nail biter. I thought, man, I don't know if they're going to go for this, but they went for it hook, line, and sinker. So so I was really happy about that. So I have no, and this isn't always the case, but in this case, I have. It's been very, very cool and very smooth.
And who's the artist you're working with?
Sebastian Perez.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about him. Like, what does he add to the mix?
Well, I saw his stuff online. I didn't know him personally, but I saw some of his recent work, and he's fantastic. He's a fantastic artist. And what I was looking for is somebody whose style could evoke the cartoon aesthetic, but not be a slave to it. I wasn't looking for Doug Wildey Part 2 or Alex Toth Part 2, but I was looking for someone who understood the pedigree of the show and understood what style is needed to sell the show to people who may have only seen the cartoon. So when they look at Sebastian's art, I mean, the pages he's done, so far I've seen the first 4 issues. You look at his art and you go, okay, that's Johnny Quest. You look at it a little harder and you go, okay, but it's not Doug Wildey and it's not Alex Toth, but he still nailed the aesthetic. So that's rare to be able to, and it takes a great artist to do your own thing, but to be true and authentic to the source material that you're pulling from. This guy gets better and better with every issue, and the stuff that's coming up that people haven't seen yet, it's gonna be blown away.
Right on. Love to hear it.
Yeah, he's great.
Chad?
Oh, you've done Ben 10, am I correct?
I've done Ben 10. You could say that, yes. I was one of the creators on the show.
I think he might be one of the co-creators of it, Chad.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
I'm slacking tonight.
Oh,
How is Ben 10 kind of compared to Johnny Quest?
Well, I think there's actually a lot of Johnny Quest in the DNA of Ben 10, even if it wasn't conscious when we created the show. There's Ben 10 has kind of a interesting family dynamic to it as well, and that's taken right from Johnny Quest. And again, when we do animation, all my partners and I in Man of Action, we are all comic book guys. We all come from comic books, so that sensibility is going to be there no matter what. So the kinship between Benton and Johnny Quest is that Doug Wildey was a comic book guy, Alex Toth was a comic book guy, we're comic book guys, and so we're bringing that to an animated series. So that, to me, that's the biggest similarity between the two shows.
Okay. So you've had your adventures in animation because, of course, you created Generator Rex as well, and now we're bringing a beloved animated property to life. Would you say that it, or life on page, I should say,
Sure.
again? Would you say that at this point it's fair to call you an animation and comic book guy, or a comic book guy who sometimes does animation stuff? Does that make sense? Like, how do you view yourself and your career?
I think of those two, it's the latter, because obviously I watched cartoons growing up, but I never had any ambitions to work in that field. It just kind of happened. But I've loved comic books since I was 5 years old. Probably wanted to make comics since I was 7 years old. So that comics have always been my first love. And, you know, in a way, if I had to choose between doing the Johnny Quest comic as we're doing it and doing a Johnny Quest show, I would choose the comic. You know, I would choose doing what we're doing, because it's, you know, it's just, I just am in love with the medium so much, and love comics, that as much as, you know, an animated series might get a bigger, wider audience. As much as animation might get a wider audience, nothing can ever replace comics as a first love for me. So I'm in it till the end.
What is it about comics that speaks to you?
That's a good question. I mean, it's one of those things where I grafted onto them so young that it was just a completely intuitive thing. It's like, you know, some people, this is inexplicable to me, I'm sure you guys, everybody does that loves comics. There are some people out there who look at a comic book page and know how to read it. They are confused. Where do I look? Which balloons do I read first? What's the order of the art that I'm supposed to read it in? I feel like I'm lucky enough to be the opposite of that. I saw comics early on and I just got it. I bonded with it as an art form. I understood it as the mechanics of it fairly early on. So it's almost like a second language to me. So it's hard to be objective and extol its virtues. But it is, to me, the greatest storytelling medium that, you know, humans have ever invented. You know, it's a limitless storytelling medium. If you can imagine it and you can execute it and get that idea out there in a very unfiltered way, with very few gatekeepers, very few barriers to get your work out there. Now with the internet, there's almost no barriers to getting your comic book work out there. So it's such a valuable thing to have that freedom of expression, that I can't imagine. It's been one of the most constant relationships of my life, these comic books, you know, and making them for the past, you know, 25, 27 years. It's been, you know, the joy of my life to be able to do this for a living.
Do you remember the first comic book you read, or maybe the one, you know, you said, you know, you've been reading them for a while. Do you remember the one that really spoke to you and led you down this path?
Well, the first one I can remember reading was, I was probably 5, 6 years old. It was an issue of Marvel Tales, which at the time was reprinting Spider-Man comics from the previous, you know, 10 years or whatever. So it was Spider-Man versus the Prowler, and it wasn't even drawn by Romita Sr., which he was the artist of the time they were reprinting those comics. It was a John Buscema a rare John Buscema Spider-Man art job.
Really?
Yeah. So that was the first one I remember. The first one that got me hooked was probably, where I really felt hard in love was probably an issue of Avengers. I'm going to go deep with the geek talk here. It's issue number 161, where Hank Pym goes nuts and becomes Ant-Man again and attacks the Avengers. Written by Jim Shooter, drawn by George Perez, and part of a classic Avengers run. But when I that was the issue that really that was like the Cupid's arrow through my heart.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, what's great about it is it still holds up. I can look at that comic now, and it still holds up. So I'm sort of grateful that some of the early comics I gravitated towards and that I fell in love with were actually good comics. They weren't like shit comics that I'd be ashamed to admit I read now. So that's a huge deal for me personally.
Yeah, I think we all have that comic that we can look back upon and say, yes, that was the moment.
Yeah.
For me, it was an issue of G.I. Joe number 80. Nothing fancy about the issue. It's a one and done story by, of course, Larry Hama. And I can look back on it now, and it's a masterclass in economic storytelling because he's got to tell a 3-act story in 22 pages. He's got to introduce these new Joes and give them each enough of a personality for us to care about them. Mm-hmm. And he has to find a way to, within that 3-act structure, engage us as a reader to care about the end of the comic. It's just perfect. It's a perfect little one and done comic, and that's how you do it. And when I was like 9 or whatever, and that comic came out, it was awesome. I probably read the cover off that thing so many times did I go through it, right?
Yeah.
And then eventually that leads to X-Men, and that just blows the doors off everything because it was X-Men #1 with Jim Lee art, and you can't do much better than that when you're like 10, 11 years old.
Yeah, it's a real it's a good kind of pressure, but I feel it to this day, which is when I'm writing a comic and making a comic, there's always a chance that it's going to be somebody's first random issue of a comic they've ever read. So you got to make sure that, you hook them as well as you can so they keep reading them.
Yeah.
So that, I feel that to this day.
Yeah. I that impresses me because especially as long form and more decompressed storytelling techniques have kind of become the norm, I feel like a lot of that has fallen away. And it makes it harder to dive in and for something to be somebody's first comic. Yeah,
I agree.
Now, you've got another new series out right now from Image called Blood Squad 7, and It is pretty new reader friendly. What can you tell us about that series?
Well, I can say that, it is new reader friendly because it's new characters, but it also has a kind of a component that if you were around for the start of the Image universe in 1992, if you invested in that shared universe where Spawn and Savage Dragon and Shadowhawk and Cyberforce and all those guys would show up in each other's comic, and it was a real tight shared universe at first, then this is the comic for you because this comic picks up on that shared universe 32 years later. In the same way that like the early Marvel universe in the 60s used the Golden Age stories from World War II as their backstory. Blood Squad 7 uses the original Image series from 92 to 96 as its backstory. The other part of that is that all those Image founders own their own characters.
Mm-hmm.
And as time went on, studios got bought, studios fell away, studios left the Image Central Collective. And in the case of Youngblood, which was the very first Image series by Rob Liefeld, certain legal bullshit has caused that series to in a sense, not exist in the Image universe anymore.
Yeah.
So Blood Squad 7 is sort of the ultimate retcon. It fills that Youngblood-sized hole in the early Image universe so that if you remember those stories, and like I said, were a reader that was invested in that universe, it's still intact for you. It's just the Blood Squad 7 characters were the ones that were there as opposed to the Youngblood characters.
Now, forgive me if I'm wrong, but you spun this series out of your Dutch one-shot and miniseries. Is that correct?
That's right. That's
And
right.
Dutch was a character that existed back in the day in the 90s.
Yeah, Dutch is sort of a loophole character because he wasn't owned by Rob Liefeld. He was owned by Chap Yates, who would draw the artist on a series called Team Youngblood at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So when we were when Image was doing this 30th anniversary anthology, I got with the publisher Eric Stevenson and came up with this notion of, well, let's contact Chap and see if we can use Dutch in a story to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the publisher. Well, to do that story and to put it into context, I had to come up with a whole backstory for Dutch that was not Youngblood. So that's where this whole Blood Squad 7 concept came into play to give Dutch the same journey, but with a different context back in the early 90s. So he was,
right.
Instead of being on Team Youngblood, he was in Blood Squad 7. So once I'd done all that backstory stuff and sort of figured that out, just to write a story, I thought, man, this is a lot of good material that we could now build a new series on. So that's where the Blood Squad 7 series started from there. It's like we had all this material, and I thought, it'd be interesting to revisit the shared Image universe 30-something years later and treat it as though it had happened in real time. So in Blood Squad 7, the original version of the team was 32 years ago. The flashbacks there's a flashback in issue 2 with Savage Dragon. There's a sort of a Spawn flashback in issue 3. You see in the comic, those take place in 1992, 1993. So we're putting it in real time. And so the modern part of the story takes place in 2024. But the original Image universe is the history of that series. So it's been a lot of fun because it's kind of the best of two worlds. It's a creator-owned world, but it's also a shared universe IP. It's I don't think it's ever been done quite like this before. As I've gone on, we've been able to frame it like this. Everybody knows Watchmen was based on the 1960s Charlton characters.
Mm-hmm.
Blood Squad 7 is sort of if Watchmen had been based on the early 90s Youngblood characters.
Okay.
That's kind of the basic pitch tonally that we're going with right now.
I like it. And it's tapping into a same vibe that another Image comic, Local Man, is tapping into. Same sandbox,
Yep.
different creators, different world, but same looking back reverently at a time in comics history when the whole, like, the barn doors just got blown off and the sky was the limit, right?
Yep.
I mean, I think the 90s get very unfairly dogged on from a lot of quarters and have for a very long time. And that's not to say that everything that was being produced was a masterpiece, but we can say that about any decade's worth of comics, right?
Sure.
So for the 90s to finally be getting its proper due is heartening to me, and as someone that grew up in the 90s.
Well, for me, it's the thing that's resonant about it in the book that we're doing is that it's not about nostalgia; it's about perspective.
Mm-hmm.
It's been long enough that we have perspective on what those characters were and what that early Image universe meant and what they were trying to do. So to put it in a perspective that gives it its proper respect and is tip of the hat to those original Image founders, that's a pretty good feeling because they deserve that,
Yeah, absolutely. I've remarked before that it seems like like doing your creator-owned book is the goal now rather than working for the big two, whereas 20, 25, 30 years ago, it was the opposite, right? Like it's just a embarrassment of wealth in creator or independent books that are creator owned right now. And I think there's no way you can say that that's not thanks in major part to the Image founders. I can appreciate everything that they've done and continue to do. Todd, we talked to Todd McFarlane a couple months ago on here, and he's every bit the same guy and same energy level that he was in 1992, 93. And it's just infectious.
Yeah.
Just infectious.
Yep.
So, Chad, jump back on in. I'm sorry, I ran.
No, that's fine. Kind of bringing it back to Johnny Quest. You said, every comic book may be somebody's first. What are you doing with Johnny Quest to try to do that?
Well, I mean, with Johnny Quest, you can sort of lean on maybe the pop cultural exposure that the characters had to some degree. But I mean, with every issue, I make sure to recap, what's gone before. I reintroduce the characters. We have the little sort of headshot key at the beginning of every issue that we're sort of like the opening credits of the show. It gives you all you need to know to move forward. But I mean, it's hard to say. Actually, I mean, to me, it's such a intuitive thing to keep every issue, even though it's a continued story, new reader friendly. It's just you kind of know it when you do it, and you feel it. And when it's not there, you can feel it too. So far so good. Every issue seems to have hit the mark for me and for people who have been reading it. So nobody's complained about being lost yet. Knock on wood.
So you mentioned that you're currently in your first arc. Do you have an overarching number of issues that you're shooting for, or is this thing just going to go on for as long as it goes on?
Well, the first two arcs will take us through almost a year's worth of stories. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of, personally for me, I'm sort of taking it an arc at a time, mainly because the marketplace being what it is, sometimes it's maybe not healthy to plan too far ahead. And it's also less fun to know what you're doing, a year and a half from now. You want to leave room to be inspired. I mean, I didn't really come up with the second arc until I was probably writing issue 4 of the first arc. And then I got this idea and I thought, well, if they'll let me do this, then I'll stick around. It was kind of contingent on that. And they agreed to it. So I'm sticking around. And I guess as I get into this second arc writing it, if I come up with another story, and they're amenable to it, well, at that point we'll see if it goes further than that. I'd like for it to, because I think the series has value, and I think that the concept has value within the landscape of comics right now. There's not really another series like it content wise. So I mean, I think, and it was the same in the 80s when Kamiko published their Johnny Quest comic book. It hit really well because it filled a niche in the marketplace that nobody was filling. Times like that don't change all that much. There's no other concept quite like this out there. So I hope it goes for a long time.
Is there a particular character from Johnny Quest that you kind of grown attached to or kind of want to explore more as you go through this run?
Well, I mean, the cliche is to say Race Bannon because he's just the coolest guy, even though I think probably shouldn't say this. I feel like Mike Pence has given Race Bannon a bad name. He's been giving him a bad rap. But having said that, he's still the coolest. He's still the coolest. But I will say, Dr. Quest, writing Dr. Quest has been a real kick because he's a scientist. He's very knowledgeable. He's kind of like he's sort of like the explainer of the group. He'll explain what's going on, and he's the brains behind the operation. And it's been fun to write his voice so that he sounds smart. He sounds like he's authentic in his intelligence, which, is not easy to do. Either you come across as too encyclopedia entry or Wikipedia entry, or you're not getting across the concepts that help sell the story. To find that balance is always a challenge. And I feel like I've struck it so far, and it's pretty satisfying to feel like when he's talking about quantum physics, or the perils of time travel, or explaining how his quantum counter works, to make it sound real but accessible is a lot of fun. Is really a lot of fun as a writer.
It's the Reed Richards conundrum.
Exactly. Exactly. And people can write Reed Richards fairly dry on occasion.
Yeah.
And I don't want Dr. Quest to be dry. I want him to be sort of, you can tell from his the chin hair and the mustache. He's a hip dude,
Absolutely. Chad? Nope, we temporarily lost Chad.
Oh no.
That's okay. It's okay. He's still with us in spirit. So, you've very famously, as I was saying at the beginning of the show, written basically every major character for every major publisher. Who haven't you written at this point that you'd still like to get your hands on?
Oh man, that's a good question. I mean, I've written in one form or another. There's really no one that I've not touched, even if I've featured them in other series that I've written. So there's a lot. I've done this for so long, and I get in different moods where sometimes you get in that mood where you find like some obscure character that you remember from when you were a kid, and you have a take, and you're like, oh, it'd be great to write that story. But for some reason, not for some reason, I mean, lately I've been in a mood to write bigger franchise characters again, big IP, as opposed to, some random miniseries with some third string character.
Right.
So the things I've been doing lately, some of which I cannot talk about, are writing some of the biggest characters in comics, which I've had my time doing that in the past, but it's been a while since I've written big franchise characters for the big publishers. Probably a good 12, 13, 14 years. So to come back to some of those bigger characters has been a lot of fun. And so that's kind of where my head is at right now, is, the biggest and the baddest.
I love it. I love to hear it. Now you say the baddest, that implies you got something up your sleeve with maybe a villain as a protagonist.
Well, no, I mean bad in the sense of, like,
all right. I had to try.
It was just old slang there. That's all.
I got you. Yeah. Well, listen, I just turned 44, so I understand the old part quite well. No worries on that front. But
I'm back.
Oh, there's Chad. So Chad, go ahead, jump back in, buddy.
So, how do you feel that you've grown as a writer, and what advice would you give your younger self that you know now that you wish you knew then?
That's a good question. I mean, I probably wouldn't. I mean, here's the thing. It's hard to say what you want to say to your younger self to do differently, because everything you did got you to where you are now, which is I'm pretty happy. So I wouldn't want to risk. I mean, getting into comics as a profession was such a tightrope walk back then. It was such a long shot, especially from where I was coming from, which was nowhere. I didn't know anybody. I didn't grow up around the business at all. So to want to make comics as a profession was like the longest of long shots when I was trying to break in. It felt like it at the time anyway. So it was really threading a needle. So to go back and say anything to that kid would, to me, be risking missing the needle, you know. And so I don't know if I would say anything. I guess I would probably I'd probably just watch him and cringe, you know. I'd be too busy going, oh my God, because I was probably quite a handful when I first got into this business, and I was pretty young and pretty full of piss and vinegar, and wasn't afraid to let anybody know that. So to go back and see that firsthand would not be comfortable at all.
So maybe
What's
just chill a little bit.
What's the biggest lesson you've learned?
Well, I guess the biggest lesson I've learned is that, you know, if you should feel confident in making any decision that you want to make, as long as you understand the consequences. You know, to make a rash decision without thinking it through and thinking to yourself, okay, if I go this way, then this might happen. Can I live with this? Can I live with this consequence? If you can, then you're probably ahead of the game. I think a lot of people leap into things without thinking about what the outcomes could be or might be. You know, to sort of fling yourself into the void. I guess in a way, when you're young, that's the time to do it. But what I've learned is that you can't keep doing that. You've got to accumulate knowledge, accumulate perspective on the business that you're in, the industry that you're in, and use that knowledge to make better decisions. I mean, to me, that's been the only way I've managed to stay in this business, is to get smarter as I've gone along into how to navigate a career, how to conduct a career. Because when I first broke in, that's all I was thinking about. How do I get in? How do I get in? Can I break in? Can I get in? I had no clue about how to stay in. I had no thoughts about how to stay in, because just getting in was such a big accomplishment that it really messed my head up for about a year afterwards.
Sure.
You know, because I was freaked out. I was like, wow, I did it. I fulfilled a childhood dream. I mean, how many people can say that? And it kind of, I went a little cuckoo for a couple months there, because I didn't quite know what's going to happen next, or what I should do to ensure that there was something to happen next.
Right.
So that was, but you know, I mean, that's growing up and becoming an adult, I suppose, really in a nutshell. You go through those experiences, and if you can survive it and come out the other side, then you've gained that knowledge, you've gained that perspective, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
That got deep, didn't it? Jesus.
That got philosophical on us, man. That was profound.
Wow.
Man.
Unbelievable.
Let's talk. Let's get back to 90s comics or something, man.
Yeah,
So, Chad.
I was going to say, what writers do you kind of, look to for influence on how you present, stuff to the page and stuff like that?
When I was younger, I think my influences are split into two categories. One is the obvious ones of anybody from my generation, the Frank Millers, the Alan Moores, the Walt Simonsons, the superstars of the 80s. But as a writer, I also have this other side of my influences that are, I guess, maybe the less superstar artists, not, no less heralded in my opinion, but they didn't break through like Frank Miller did, or like Alan Moore did, or Neil Gaiman. And that would be guys like David Michelinie, Mike Baron, big Mike Baron fan. He's probably my favorite writer when I was a teenager. Those guys that were, in the trenches, doing John Ostrander, those guys that were just in there month in, month out, just producing good work. That was various, but Keith Giffen, huge Keith Giffen fan.
Yeah.
So I mean, and these guys are within our industry. They're very well respected and very heralded, but they're not the breakout legends. I mean, they are to me. I mean, to me, I put Howard Chaykin up there with Frank Miller and Alan Moore as a groundbreaking guy and a huge influence and massive, massive talent. And I think I value those influences more. As much as I love Alan Moore, as much as I love Frank Miller, I'm much more, my DNA has much more of David Michelinie and Mike Barron in it than those guys, I think,
Well, when you break it down, like it's those guys that you mentioned that are able to grind it out every month for years on end.
Yeah.
And still produce damn good comics.
Yeah.
Maybe not the most revolutionary thing you've ever read, but a damn good comic nonetheless. Because not everybody's going to be the next Frank Miller or Alan Moore in the 80s, right? Obviously. And nor should they aspire to be.
Those are flukes. Those guys are flukes. There's the right place at the right time and the right talent for that moment. But I look at guys like Jim Shooter, Steve Englehart, Steve Gerber, Don McGregor. I mean, they kind of predate me by a generation. I kind of came in as a reader at the tail end of their work at Marvel in the 70s. But those are some of my foundational influences. They're the first things I remember reading in life. So they're going to be part of who I am, no matter what. And like I said before, I'm thrilled that my earliest impressions were of guys that were actually very good,
Right.
Feel really lucky for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So who do you look at today as peers or someone that's come up behind you that inspires you at that level?
That's a great question. That's a good question because there are guys sort of within my generation that I'm a fan of, but I know I would never. But because I'm a fan, I would not think of them as peers. I would think of them. I mean, they're separate from that.
Sure.
I think the guys that have come after me, I guess, and I mean, he's a friend of mine too. But I think a guy like Michel Fiffe, who does Copra. Independent comic. He's done other things too for Marvel and DC and Image. I mean, I'm like in love with that guy's work, and he's a fully formed, fully all-rounded cartoonist. I mean, he writes and draws, does everything,
right,
and self-publishes as well. So he does a lot of things that I'm incapable of doing. So not only is he great, but I have a lot of respect for him in the way he's conducted his career and the way he does his business, So I think that's the guy that comes to mind when you ask that question.
Right on. I get you.
Yeah.
Chad?
So, do you want people to take something away from your Johnny Quest run? What do you hope to add to Pat?
Well, I mean, there's two ambitions for this series. One is that if you don't know anything about Johnny Quest, never heard of it, have no clue about what it's about, what the show was about, and you just have no idea, you can come to the comic book and walk away from it as a new Johnny Quest fan. That you're into the characters and that you felt like you were introduced to something great in your life. That's one side of it. The other side is if you are a dyed-in-the-wool Johnny Quest fan and know top to bottom everything about it, that you'll feel like when you read this book that you're coming home, because it's chock full of Easter eggs visually and in the story. that if you're a real Johnny Quest head, I think you'll appreciate. So satisfying both of those camps is that's what we're trying to do. Satisfy them both equally. Bring in new fans, satisfy the old fans. If we can do both of those things, I think we'll have really accomplished something.
Awesome. For however many issues it goes.
Exactly. Look, nothing lasts forever. Again, the first
Right.
the Johnny Quest was only one season, so we take what we can get and we appreciate what we get.
Absolutely.
I think earlier you mentioned the Dynamites, doing stuff like Space Ghost and other, cartoon properties. And I know in the past when they've been with other companies, they've done crossovers. Do you foresee something like that happening again, or is everybody going to be playing in their own little sandbox?
I think I foresee some intermingling at some point between these properties, but I wouldn't want to say for sure at the moment. But because it's always fun to stay in your own sandbox. However, it's fun to make connections between characters as well. So that's all I'll say. That might be a tease. That might be just me speculating. But take it for what you will.
I think we can run with that, don't you, Chad?
We'll find something to do with it,
Yeah.
I think I will say this: if you're looking for that, then stick around for the second story arc in Johnny Quest.
Okay. Look, we've got David Pepose on speed dial. I can find out if his plans for Space Ghost are dovetailing pretty quick. So, but no, it's always heartening whenever we are able to find out that there's new life and new love for characters that been around a while or maybe been collecting dust on the shelf for a while, right?
Sure.
Because there's always value in something that was sprung from the creative mind. I mean, especially if you're talking about something that had designs by Alex Toth. Like,
Yeah.
come on. It's a no-brainer. But we're also 60 years removed from that first cartoon show. And I mean, there's kids growing up now that they've never heard of Johnny Quest, right? So how do you walk that tightrope between being true to the original and creating something that can appeal to some 12-year-old that's never heard of Johnny Quest before?
Well, I think because I straddle those two camps myself. I mean, I like Johnny Quest. I watched him when I was a kid. I read the comic, but I wouldn't say that I was a dyed-in-the-wool fan. Where I knew everything off the top of my head, and I mean, I could tell you a lot of things about a lot of IP over the years. Johnny Quest, I would say that I'd had a fairly more than a cursory knowledge. I knew the characters, I knew the show, I knew what it was supposed to be or what it was. I knew who was involved in the making of the show, but I couldn't tell you. In episode 3, the villain was this, and I just wasn't that deep. So I could come at it I could remove myself and come at it, seemingly with fresh eyes, but I also had a sense of what the IP was all about. So given that, if I'm feeling like I'm hitting both sides of it in the stuff that we're doing, I feel like, look, I've been doing this a while. I feel like I have a pretty good sense of if I'm hitting the mark or not. And with Johnny Quest, from early on, from the moment I wrote the first script, and especially when I saw Sebastian's pages coming in, I knew we were hitting that mark. We were going to satisfy both camps equally. So in that respect, the audience is me. If I'm digging it and I feel like I'm hitting both sides, and I gotta have faith that is what I'm doing. I'm not just deluding myself.
Right on. So we're coming up towards the end of our hour, and I just where can we find you on social media these days?
I'm not really a big social media guy. My company, Man of Action Entertainment, you can find us on Twitter or X or whatever, and on Instagram. It's not. It's sort of a way to keep up with what the company's doing.
I got you.
For myself, I tend to. This may change in the future, but for now, I've been content to just let my work be my social media platform.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
Chad, do you have anything else to throw out there?
No, I was just going to say that's probably a lot safer than being on social media. Period.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
a little bit safer, just a scotch.
Yeah. I think my
So,
life's been a lot easier going that route.
yeah, I'm sure it has.
Are you going to be doing any shows or appearances anywhere?
I don't think I've got anything booked for the rest of this year, but next year, who knows? I'm gonna have I'm a lot more workout even than I do now in 2025. So there may be opportunities to get out there and do the grip and grin again. We'll see.
That's awesome. So we've got 2 issues of Johnny Quest out. When does issue 3 ship? When can we find it in stores?
I think mid-October.
Okay, we'll take it.
And we've also got the end of October. Got Blood Squad 7 Strike File #1, which is our version of the annuals that Marvel and DC used to put out every year. Oversized issue. But it's still part of the continuity. Obviously, it's just the next chapter in the story. But we thought it'd be fun again with a nod back to the old how they used to do Youngblood Strike File and things like that. It's another nod to the early Image universe there, with a guest appearance by Eric Larson's classic character Super Patriot.
Heck yeah, I love Super Patriot and Savage Dragon.
Yeah, so do I.
So, all right. Well, Joe Casey, thank you so much for hanging out with us. I did not slip and say Joe Kelly once during the entire interview. So, yay me. But thank you very much for hanging out with us tonight. Thank you for your body of work and that you continue to add to this thing we call comics. You can check us out on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and at comic-watch.com. And as ever, the world may be a crappy place sometimes, but it doesn't have to be. Get out there, do something good for your fellow man, read a comic, and support local businesses. Thank you so much for listening, and we are the Comic Watchers, and this is our show. Thank you very much.